Hello, welcome to Mysterium Simiae. My name is Josh Kiltmaker. I'm your host. This inaugural podcast is a very special one. I have spent the last almost 10 years researching Bigfoot on my own. Like you, I've paid close attention to all the findings and evidence and anecdotal stories that come out, with great interest, some disappointment. But I was really inspired by some of the podcasts that I heard. Sasquatch Chronicles, Wes Germer's baby, being one of them. Shannon LeGros' Into the Fray was also another. I wanted to create a podcast where I could have a veritable mix of encounter stories, roundtables, and personal dialogue and thoughts on the ways and means of conducting Bigfoot research, if you could actually even really call it that today. In my line of work, as my last name suggests, I am a kilt maker, and I keep Bigfoot action figures in my shop. It invites curiosity, and not only curiosity, but it also invites personal experiences. Working in Northern California, I'm sure you can imagine quite a few people, when they see them, offer me up a tale either of a relative or a friend, and in a few cases, personal. Over the last 10 years, 3 personal anecdotal accounts caught my attention that I documented, and I'll be releasing those in subsequent podcasts. But for this first one of my clients, who is a lawyer in Roseville, California, told me the most incredible encounter story, and with so much seriousness and really a lot of passion for, at the same time, someone who didn't want to be part of this phenomenon. And that's the story that I'm going to read you today. I took very meticulous notes, and I recorded his story. I had him, he didn't want, of course, for obvious reasons. There's still that stigma that if you admit to being a knower or someone who's encountered Bigfoot, if you're a professional, it could mean suicide in the workforce. So he remains anonymous, but I think you're going to enjoy this encounter. It really terrified me the first time he told me. I actually had him come back, and I recorded him telling it to me again, and it was just terrifying. I think it's probably the most terrifying, realistic encounter story that I've ever heard. So once again, thank you for joining me on this inaugural podcast. My name is Josh Kiltmaker, and here we go. I want to preface my telling you of this terrifying encounter that happened to me with a warning. The adage, "Be careful what you wish for," is absolutely true. I never believed in Sasquatch. I never thought of Sasquatch. And other than the Patterson-Gimlin film I saw as a kid, I never even thought there might be more than one. My life, my reality, my relationships, my ethics, everything changed that July day in 2010. The reverberations still last to this day, and I find myself trying to rebuild my life and exist knowing what I know. After experiencing what I experienced and having to live on after the fact, I am the quintessential accidental witness. Here is my encounter as best as I can tell it. And believe me, exaggerating portions of the story are not necessary. I begin with myself. I'm an attorney in Roseville, California. I'm a single dad with a beautiful daughter of whom I love to the moon and back. And in 1996, I went to Kenya for a safari, and while there, I was driven around in an old Land Rover 4x4 that I just fell in love with. Thus my story begins. I had owned a Toyota Land Cruiser from the 70s that I had bought in the early part of the millennia, but I had really yearned for one of those Land Rovers that I had so fallen in love with in Kenya back in '96. The spring of 2010, I was contacted by a friend in Reno that had seen one about 40 minutes drive from where he lived. I put him to task and had him approach the owner and ask on my behalf to sell. Flat out no. Which was disappointing because it was a 1974 Archer Green Land Rover with the horizontal bench seats in back. It was choice. It was what I wanted. 2 months later, the same friend called me and told me the owner called and asked if I'd still be interested in buying. Life happened and he needed quick money. A deal was struck, and mid-July, I flew with my daughter to Reno in the morning from Sacramento. I remember it being a blazing hot day. I'm sure it was in the 100s. After a late breakfast, we made the short drive to Cold Springs, where I picked up my 1974 Land Rover Series 3. My plan was to make the 2.5-hour drive back to Roseville with my daughter and take 70 all the way to Route 49 and enjoy the scenes, all in the spirit of driving my new old Land Rover. The Landy was old, but pretty well taken care of. One immediate problem I noticed was that every little bump reverberated through the vehicle. I knew I was in for some repair and maintenance work, but for the moment, I felt okay with it. As I drove west on 70, I cut south on 89 and decided to drive the Gold Lake Highway. Now, I want to say that this stretch of road is some of the prettiest in California. The forested knolls, valley cuts, and foothills east of Mount Elwell are some of the most fantastic scenery you will ever encounter. We drove along with all the windows down, enjoying the view, even though it was unusually hot. The Gold Lake area is actually comprised of about 6 lakes, some small, some big, and there are a couple of lodges that dart the way, a campground, hiking trails, and even a golf course at the northern end at Griegel. As we drove along, I was inspired by the beauty of the terrain and decided it would be fun to take the small road down to Gold Lake and take a breather from the heat and go down to the shores. Gold Lake was absolutely beautiful, and on a side note, I do highly recommend it as a getaway. It is classic California nature at its finest. We were enjoying the stop when we happened upon a couple who were also driving the highway on their motorcycle, and we struck up a brief conversation. They had been here many times before and suggested we go up to the falls. I explained that my daughter certainly wouldn't make the trek, but the man thought that the hiking trail also doubled as a service road in case of fire, and that my 4x4 could easily make it. It was here that I made the worst decision of my life. I thought instantly no. Fish and game were around, rangers. If I got nailed driving a service road, or worse, a designated hiking trail, that would be it. Fines out the butt. I'm a lawyer, but I know better than messing with the state. California can be ruthless. But then I started thinking that I hadn't really tried my 4x4. Like a teenager, that feeling of excitement overtook me, and the mental decision was made. We finished our conversation, and I took down the directions on how to get to the trail that leads to the falls. I thanked them, wished them well, and put my daughter in the back of the Landy, this time on one of the back side benches, so she could have that safari experience, so to speak. Off we went. Back on the highway, I for the life of me could not find the opening. I went back and forth for 30 minutes and could find nothing. I finally gave up and returned to my journey south and was resigned to just go home. 10 minutes passed in the other direction. I happened to see what looked like a trail entrance on the right. It wasn't marked, and this was not the way I was told, but it was seemingly wide enough for my Land Rover, and the incline was not too bad, so off I went. I hedged the knoll at the entrance and looked down into the heavy forested area. I will admit, I thought this might be a bad idea, but I engaged the 4x4 and started to slowly make my way down the trail. After 20 feet, I realized this was going to be impossible and that this was not a service road. The Land Rover felt like she was going to be shaken apart. The suspension problem was amplified by 10, and the 4x4 felt more like a carnival ride than a vehicle. I looked back at my daughter, who was holding on for dear life, and I told her to come up and sit with me up front. The trail narrowed to literally the width of the vehicle at times. There were areas that I could have just gone off-road and turned around, but I was really concerned about getting stuck, and I wanted to find a more secure pull-off to turn around and get out. The vehicle slammed up and down, side to side, for 10 grueling minutes. I finally saw a pull-off to the left. It looked like the area was clear and would be a perfect turnaround. It was at this moment that my daughter, who had been strangely quiet, vomited all over her shirt and the floorboards. What else could go wrong? When I got to the cleared area, I could see 30 yards away to my left, a creek of sorts of which I thought was a godsend. I turned the Landia around and drove up to about 10 yards away from the creek edge. There was nothing striking about this creek, nothing seemingly dangerous. It was about as wide as a 2-lane road with a deep center and babbling edges at the shoreline, which was perfect for cleaning my daughter. When we got out and walked up to the shore edge where I began to wash her shirt, my daughter finally smiled. She amused herself playing with a spinning green leaf caught in a micro eddy at the edge of the creek. I felt nothing but relief that I could clean her up, and that she was actually having fun for a moment playing in the water. I stood up and glanced from right to left and admired the view. The forest on the far bank came right up to the creek. It was beautiful. For a brief moment, I felt I was in an idyllic spot and was glad for this brief adventure. Then the smell. Okay, I want to tell you just how amazing our bodies are. Because we live in cities and populated suburban areas, many of our olfactory senses lie dormant. But our ability to smell is incredible, and that's exactly what shattered my feeling of peace and beauty in an instant. I want to take a stab at this because after my encounter, I heard other witnesses try and describe the smell. It is usually a cliched hodgepodge that doesn't quite explain it to me. You know, the wet dog, feces, skunk. It's kind of close. But what they can't explain is the hanging stink, stuck in your nose pungency. The smell instantly made me stand up, and my nostrils were filled with an aroma that hung in the air, and it was like roofing tar. It was sulfurish, mixed with that tarish / feces smell. There were elements of decay, but it was that heavy tar, sulfur, feces smell that put my brain into hyper-alert mode with the flight instinct screaming at me. I thought to myself that a mountain lion was near and stalking us. I looked down at my oblivious daughter sitting at my feet, playing in the water. I could hear my heart thumping in my ears. I could feel my innards tightening. I was becoming paralyzed with fear and indecision. I knew if I ran, I might provoke a chase response. I just didn't know what to do for a moment. I looked behind us. I looked to the left. I looked to the right. I turned around and looked across the creek. Now, I'm going to stop here for a moment. Few people actually experience mortal fear. It is like trying to describe combat or being attacked by a great white shark. You can tell, try and explain with big adjectives, but this kind of fear is almost out of body. Every life experience you've accumulated to that point means nothing at all. You are at the mercy and whim of something greater than you, and I realized no matter how my brain was instantly trying to compute it, I was looking at something that was not supposed to really exist. When I look back at this moment, I have to compartmentalize it into stages. It was almost like the stages of death, fear, then denial, then anger, then acceptance. As I said, it began with that pungent smell that hit me like a locomotive. When I scanned behind us, I saw nothing. When I scanned the shoreline across the creek, I saw nothing. But that burnt husk of a tree that must have been from a wildfire that I casually noticed earlier caught my attention. And it wasn't a hulking, burnt, massive tree trunk. It was something on two legs, standing upright, at the edge of the far side of the creek, near the forest line. My brain is processing. My fear has paralyzed me. I want to think this is a bear, but my brain has passed that option and has settled on some kind of King Kong monster. It was a mannish ape, and I cannot tell you in words how massive it was. I know you've heard that before, but because there is no primate on this earth anywhere remotely this big, one's brain just stutters. It was jet black with shortish hair on the lower body and some stranding as you got higher on the arms and head. It was a male for sure. The width of shoulder to shoulder was as wide as maybe my Land Rover, and again, I'm not exaggerating. I'm 6'5", and by sight, this primate was almost twice my height and weighed easily 800 pounds. Its musculature was unbelievable. Now, I've heard comparisons to cartoonish, and I agree with that. I'm paralyzed. I cannot move, and I can hardly breathe. My heartbeat is bursting in my ears. I lock eyes. I see no whites, but I can see viscous shine off of them. Its head is roundish, not human round, nor primate round, but kind of a bulky round with some slight coning. It was not proportionate, and that added to my brain stutter. Its mouth and nose were huge, but there were no serious protruding mandibles as chimps, gorillas, or orangutans have. It was slight, but that is the difference between them. That's what gives them that slightly cavemanish look. If the nose had been upturned and the mandibles protruded, they would for sure look like those, Gigantopithecus models that you see on the internet that reside in museums. I am stuck, locked eyes, but then something relieves me for but an instant. I felt my fear level go down enough to regain some composure. This creature was not moving at all, was not swaying, not a step, not a lean, perfectly still. This is a hoax. I have been hoaxed. Some student at Chico State has built an incredible recreation of a Bigfoot and placed it here and is filming people getting the shit scared out of them and uploading it to YouTube. I really did think this for a moment. And I did the stupidest thing I think I could have done in this situation. I looked around as if I was looking for someone and yelled, "That's not nice." The moment after I raised my voice, that fear swept right back. This enormous thing that I thought was a hoax opened the corner of its mouth and began tonguing its molar like you do if a piece of food was stuck and you were trying to dislodge it. Its off-pink inner mouth with spotted tongue was clear to me as day. This was a real Sasquatch, and time enough had gone by for it sizing us up for whatever it was going to do. My momentary come down gave me the strength to decide to make a run for the landy. It continued to look at me, and some slight swaying began. Without breaking my gaze, I began to reach down towards my daughter, who this whole time had been oblivious. And as my hand got near her head, my thumbnail passed over her upper ear, and she let out a high chirp squeal. The terror I felt overwhelmed me again at this point as I saw the Sasquatch's eyes open up as wide as they could open, exposing some sclera, which made the eyes look as big as baseballs. It was at this moment I saw its muscular frame flex. Oh my God. The astounding size and structure was unimaginable, and I'll never stop saying that. Something was about to happen. I gathered my courage, my heart thumping in my chest, my breath restricting, the feeling of flight finally upon me. It was time to grab my daughter and run. I reached down and firmly grabbed my daughter by the arm, never losing gaze with the Sasquatch. The Sasquatch drew in a massive breath, turned its whole body, and leapt into the forest line in one forward lunge, and let out a scream that was as loud as those old early warning sirens that they used to blow every Thursday at 12 noon from the bank of the West Building. It was deafening. It was unending. It made me dizzy. I grabbed my daughter and I ran. 10 yards seemed like a mile. The scream was continuing. I threw my daughter in the front and shut the door. As I ran around the Land Rover to my side, I glanced back over the creek. The Sasquatch was on all fours in an aggressive posture, as if about to take one leap across and run to us. The scream was still going on. I still felt myself becoming dizzy as I jumped into the seat, turned the landy on, and released the brake. Luckily, I was pointed in the right way and began to tear down the trail that I had come down. We were bouncing out of our seats. I was driving so fast. It was the longest ride I'd ever taken. I kept looking in the rear, but nothing. The forest crept right up to the sides on the trail at spots. I felt sure at any moment the Sasquatch would barrel the side of my Land Rover. I didn't care. I had to get my daughter out of there. We blazed out the entrance and literally caught a little air coming out and over the knoll down to the highway. I'm sure it looked like a scene out of the Dukes of Hazzard. Safely on the road, I hauled ass to 49 and went all the way to Sierra City, where I felt okay to pull off at a coffee shop there. I sat in the parking lot, not able to do anything. My adrenaline rush was finished, and now my body and brain was processing what just happened. I looked over at my daughter, who was seemingly fine, and changed her in to her spare Wonder Woman undershirt and some shorts. I asked her if she was okay, and she said of course. Her 4-year-old brain having been oblivious to all that happened. I couldn't believe it. I asked if she saw what I saw. She said she did not. To this day, she says her only memory of that day is being by the creek edge, playing and hearing a tree fall and police sirens. That's it. Lucky girl. I, on the other hand, decided that I needed to call the police and went into the coffee house to do so. I did not have cell service here and was going to use their phone. I told the young guy at the counter briefly what happened, and he gave me this look and said, "Sir, listen to me. You can use our phone, but I'm advising you not to do this." I asked why. He just said, "Nothing ever comes from it, and you'll be viewed suspicious, and you don't want to be in the radar of area rangers, the police, or Fish and Game." That made me wonder if this was a common occurrence. He said this with no emotion at all, as it was yet another person coming with a Sasquatch tale to tell. He gave me a coffee and water and let me sit. My daughter had a juice, and I took some needed time to compose myself. I had to get home. I had to process this all. Upon returning home, I called my friend in Reno and told him my fantastical story. I had never heard him laugh so hard in his life. "Come on, man. Is this for real? You mistook a bear or something. Yada, yada." I was crushed, but this is really only the beginning. I spent the next week coming to terms, denying it, trying to make sense of it, trying to think what it could have been. I work with professional witnesses all the time, and I also work with happen chance witnesses also. The latter can be unreliable, and I understand more than others the weakness of a brain in stress. My encounter was not fleeting. It lasted maybe 5 to 10 minutes. I utilized sight study as police are trained to do. I mentally deducted possibilities in the moment. This was a Sasquatch. A sort of jubilation then swept over me. I was one of the few who positively knew these were real. They were not made up. They existed. The questions began to pour in like rain as I accepted my encounter. I stopped taking clients for a year and focused on studying the Bigfoot culture in this country. I was lucky to converse with another lawyer in Oregon who had had a sighting. His was actually documented on one of those shows. He advised me not to come forth in public with my story. It would ruin my professional line of work as it did his. He eventually had to move into a new line of work as his name, when Googled, which everyone does these days, had him attached to his encounter. Within a year, he was not practicing law anymore. So I lurked. I went to conferences. I never told anyone my story, but listened to many. I became more and more depressed as I began to realize that the Bigfoot community was full of people that were attention-seeking liars. My line of work puts me in the company of liars all the time, and I know the signs. Then the whole portal, shape-shifting, paranormal element began, and that was just it. I realized that I was on my own for this. Except for a select few, my Bigfoot experience is wholly my own. All these years later, the memory haunts me daily. I have not been able to remarry or have any meaningful relationships. My story is a deal breaker, and holding it in always creates problems. I also have such empathy for people who have encounters like mine that I feel are the truth. Before, I would roll my eyes. Now I have to question, what about my experience? So I exist today, haunted by something that happened. I've seen a therapist, and that helps. But I could see in her eyes the disbelief. I've even gone on a BFRO expedition. It was a night of nothing but people seeing and hearing Sasquatch everywhere. I kept quiet and returned home disappointed. So therein lies my story and my warning. Be careful what you wish for. To this day, almost 9 years later, I'm still reeling from the terrifying encounter I had on that trail near Gold Lake with my daughter. Yeah, take all of that in. That's probably one of the scariest encounters that I've ever heard in my life. Feel free to email me, mysteriumsimiae@gmail.com, and make sure you leave a positive note for this podcast. Give it thumbs up, give it a good rating so we can get into the mix, and I will see you next week. I've got 2 other encounter stories that I've collected, both equal to this. And I hope to see you then. Until then, keep believing.